Great. Thank you so much and good morning. I'm here with Audrey Tang calling in from Taiwan.
Hello, good local time, everyone.
So how are you this morning?
Pretty good. Just woke up, returned from the Taoyuan city back to the Taipei city, and now I'm back in the cabinet office.
Wow. And I know that I'm just going to jump into it and just ponder out loud that I imagine that sort of politically speaking, we may look like as much of a circus as we probably project out to the world, but I just want to know how your week is unfolding so far.
Well, my week so far, like the past 4 days, well, it's been a interesting experience. Just yesterday, around 24 hours ago, I was in the confronting disinformation Harvard Kennedy School conversation, and it was just really interesting to kind of look back at our counter disinformation strategy. It's called humor over rumor, with a cute spokesdog and things like that, and just reflect how this like no takedown, no lockdown premise, because in Taiwan we remember the martial law, so we wouldn't do administrative takedown, and we remember how bad SARS 1.0 and the lockdown was, so we wouldn't do a lockdown, and how that has really informed our strategy of cross-sectoral collaboration, and how this society at large, I mean the worldwide society, now most of the countries have some experience with lockdowns, how that may motivate them into working into a more resilient way of working with the virus, both of the mind and of the body.
From this perspective here in the States, everything I read about the response having come from Taiwan, as well as your background and having listened to interviews you've given, in the last 6, 7, 8 months regarding this topic. And the people that I have shared the story of Taiwan with, as it pertains to not just, as you mentioned, the pandemic, but the infodemic, from here looks like science fiction. Everyone that I had shared the story with and shared relevant, current information regarding it, there is a moment in which people are temporarily able to almost see clearly, if you will, what is possible and what is happening elsewhere in this world that we share. And yet I don't know how to respond to people when they share that it is seemingly science fiction, given not just the citizens' perspective on the pandemic, but also the government's response. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how that transparent governance, that two-way system, is doing.
Sure. Although when I was a child, I read mostly like evidence-based science fiction, like literally the short story Evidence from Asimov. So not all science fiction are fantasies, like the amazing stories. So there are also stories based on scientific rigor, and social science is a kind of science too. And one of the most rigorous findings of the social sciences, at least around our corner of the world, is that the more the government trusts its citizens, the more citizens become worthy of trust. It's called the Pygmalion effect. It's been studied by social scientists. And because very early on, we understood that if we get 3/4 of people wearing masks and washing their hands regularly, then the R naught value will be under 1. And that's, again, science, right? It's a modeling by our top epidemiologist who literally wrote a textbook, also actually our vice president at the time. And so at the time, we all learned from VP Chen Jianren that there is just this 3/4 goal to be met. The thing is that we can ramp up mass production, we can even deliver it to people's hands, but it doesn't ensure necessarily proper use. It doesn't ensure necessarily that people combine it with hand sanitation and later on physical distancing. And so how to make it work, right? So I think the Pygmalion effect is the strongest when the people think that when the CECC, the Central Epidemic Command Center, tells us to wear a mask, well, we wear a mask. But even when CECC, for like 48 hours, said that in well-ventilated places on the metro, when the metro is running, and if you're healthy, you don't need to wear a mask. Well, people wear a mask anyway. So the idea is that there's a strong social sector demand for the economic sector to work with the government to deliver as much masks as there are in the citizenry each day, and people are not satisfied until they can get to that number. So it becomes a popular demand, and so comes along the social innovation. For example, using traditional rice cookers, one can disinfect the mask, kill the virus, but not destroy the PPE material, and reuse the medical mask, even though it's designed as one-time use, but you can reuse it 3 to 5 times. Now that's social innovation because rice cookers wasn't invented for that purpose. Neither is medical mask, by the way. But our Food and Drug Administration repeated the experiment as scientifically required and found that it's exactly the case. And so we invited Professor Lai Chuanyu, the social innovator, to explain the science in our daily CCC press conference, while the Minister of Health and Welfare, Chen Shizhong, literally cooked the mask in front of the nation. And that's social innovation. That's promoting social innovators and amplifying their new ideas so that we can hit a 3/4 goal, and people would actually understand that it's their idea, their innovation that makes it happen sooner, not a top-down government approach.
I wonder if, given the predominant culture of I, me, mind here in the United States, how can anyone, not even just as a citizen here, but how can anyone begin to speak to the larger society here to explain the difference between protecting yourself and in doing so, you're able to protect other people by wearing masks? It seems as though the notion of masks as some kind of a personal infringement or sort of censorship kind of issue is such as it's as crazy as wildfire here, quite literally.
I think one of the things that we get right from the beginning was taking a entirely rational self-interest message when it comes to mask use. The spokestalk literally said that you wear a mask to protect yourself from your own unwashed hands. So there's nothing altruistic in this.
Right.
And it combines mask use and hand sanitation. And I bet that this message will also have a higher R value than you wear a mask to show respect, or you wear a mask to protect other people in your country as well. So I think appealing to self-interest is bound to have a higher R value. I don't think there's much of a cultural difference here.
Right. Interesting. That's good to point out. I appreciate that. I have so many questions all simultaneous at the same time. Are you drinking tea or coffee right now?
I just had some coffee early in the morning. Yeah.
Okay. Are you a tea drinker by chance?
Yes.
Are you familiar by chance with the Taoist practice of tea ceremony?
Yes.
Also known as Cha Dao.
Yes, of course.
It's something that I have been studying and practicing through mentorship with actually an expatriate who's based in Miaoli and I guess close to Taipei. Mm-hmm. And that's a community called Global Tea Hut. And I find it not only just something that, tea as an immersive experience is something that is also touches on notions of, hygiene, sanitation, kind of cleansing, not just physically speaking, but also kind of spiritually speaking. And I wonder if those notions, given the sort of the fabric of society in Taiwan, this is maybe too complex of a question at this moment.
Okay,
Forgive me.
yeah, we first started this whole open source, open publication, blogging, and so on movement in Taipei. And we meet weekly. That was in the early 2000s in the Wisteria Wisteria Tea House.
Mm-hmm.
And Wisteria Tea House is one of the main places. It's a kind of historical building where many of the Taiwan's democratic struggles and movements were born out of, and so I think it's just right that in the around the turn of century, the internet-based blogging culture and so on, that's also one of the major part of it. And the owner or the current steward of the Wisteria Tea House, Zhou Yu, at the time was just proposing the four words, 正静清远, to be rigorous, to be calm, to be clear, and to be circular, and in his chadao. And I think we all learned quite a bit from that in our blogging circle, also very circular.
Beautiful. I've heard of Wisteria, and I look forward one day to visiting. I also read that you you touch on Taoism as a resource for how you develop your philosophies and how you operate as a digital minister. I wonder if you could touch on that as well.
Sure. So I think usually I use the Ursula Le Guin translation because I think it's more poetic, and I think it's the idea that the wholeness, right? I translated that just a moment ago, the zheng as rigor, but you can also translate as wholeness, and so, or integrity, for lack of a better term. And I think the idea is, to quote Tao Te Ching, the 39th chapter, heaven through its wholeness is pure, earth through its wholeness is steady, spirit through its wholeness is potent. The valley through its wholeness flows with rivers, and the 10,000 things through their wholeness live. So rulers through their wholeness have authority. Their wholeness makes them what they are. And so a very interesting thing is that to me, the quotation, the line in it that says, the valley through this wholeness flows with rivers. So not for the rivers, not by the rivers, but not of the rivers, but with the rivers. And this is the very Taoist notion of making a space, not a object. And the space contains objects, but does not belong to any particular object. And so the potentials can realize themselves, actualize themselves without being foreclosed by whichever object that was in the valley, so to speak. And so it could be, of course, a real valley in a face-to-face setting for carbon-based life forms, or it could be a silicon valley for digital forms of expression.
Excellent. I've been ruminating on a question leading up to this conversation, again, to kind of go back into the seemingly stark differences, culturally speaking, between the States and Taiwan. I wonder if, given that here in the States, we are an amalgamation of so many different cultures and races and languages and ideologies, I wonder if there is a lack of social cohesion compared to a citizenry like Taiwan, which is, predominantly Han Chinese, as I understand. So,
But with 20 national languages.
with 20 national languages.
And even the Han Chinese have 3 dominant languages, the Hakka, the Taiwanese Holok, and Mandarin.
I was curious if you could speak to the potential of, at some point, diversity in ideologies, not purely about races or backgrounds in terms of places of origin, but just in terms of ideologies or religious differences. Is there a point at which perhaps here there isn't a possibility of like real social cohesion, or does the perceived lack of cohesion kind of bring us beyond a point of being able to kind of unify together as a culture here?
Yeah, but I think cohesion is overrated. It's one of those ideas like harmonization of society,
Right.
and we don't quite believe in harmonization of the society. That some nearby jurisdiction that's more into it, and so in Taiwan, I usually translate the official country name of the cabinet office government that I'm currently in, which is in Mandarin 中华民国, and I usually translate it as the Transcultural Republic of Citizens. And so, as in Republic of Citizens, as in 公民之国, a country with its citizens as its foundation, and 中华 being 在华之中, literally in the middle of various flowers. So it's a transcultural view, right? It's not let's plant the same kind of flower and have it dominate the garden, because that idea was first developed by Sun Yat-sen and his revolutionary friends to explain how to not entirely write off the Manchurian culture while having the ethnic Han working with the Manchurian culture that was the Qing dynasty, among other cultures, in a transcultural way, not in the assimilation kind of way. And so that idea, I think, is universal. It doesn't need to be Han and Manchurian. It could be between any cultures if one learned that from different cultures, they're like pieces of a puzzle that one offers to complete one another's perspectives, and one does not actualize one's own upbringing unless you can actually view it from a very different culture than the one of your upbringing. That's also something like Ubuntu, the African equivalent at work here, right? One only actualizes through a larger community as opposed to the smaller community,
Right.
and by contributing to it. And Ubuntu, by the way, is also a very familiar term in Silicon Valley. So anyway, so my point here is that transculturalism is the main thing that we're having a perspective of the dialogue. And as long as the dialogue is around common values, I don't think the different or varying positions is necessarily a bad thing. I think it actually contributes to the potential of the dialogue.
Which is actually a really good lead in into, or perhaps it's a better framing, right? And instead of focusing on cohesion, it's really focusing on common values.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if here we are just having well, not to simplify it too much, but we may just be suffering from a framing issue to not see common values, but to see pure division by way of how we navigate through social media, how we navigate through adverts and political wills, and just kind of seemingly this fracturing of society. And I feel like I'm speaking about it in a kind of a sort of a dramatic way, but I also,
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying that just from my perspective of being in here and kind of being surrounded by it. I wonder if you could speak to how you're viewing this process that we're going through here.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the takedown slash lockdown side effect, the negative externality that it has on the society. And it's not a new thing, right? Since ancient times, the way to combat either pandemic or infodemic has been physical distancing, the closing of borders, lockdown of cities, suspensions of civic assembly, and mutual distrust seems to be inevitable. There's a sense of inevitableness if you do this kind of lockdown slash takedown. And also, in such a more isolated mood, people are eager to blame the spread of the virus of the body or of the mind outside us, those of different races, different nationalities, different beliefs, and that leads then to a even more divisive virus of the mind, the us versus them kind of binary thinking that only grows with the pandemic and infodemic. So it really is a self-reinforcing circle, but the circle can be broken. I mean, just like the physical vaccine protects oneself from one's own unwashed hands. Maybe with the virus that has lived on the surface of the table for days, with SARS 2.0, that is the current virus we're dealing with, knowing for sure that a physical vaccine protects yourself from your own hands, gives people a sense of calm and assurance that this will pass, and this will pass with us in it together, because mask is a social signal. And so something like the medical mask used in Taiwan, which has already been a fashion statement, as you can clearly see here.
That one.
That's right. Yeah, and it's rainbow colored for the people who listen. So I think just turn it into a sense of self-expression, and through the self-expression, you can also signal that my focus is on the common values. It could be, for example, around intergenerational solidarity. Among, for example, Taiwan's most controversial referenda, there was 2 referenda around marriage, right? The people who are older see marriage predominantly as something between 2 families, with each young person only acting as representative of their families. But the younger generations see marriage more as an individual to individual thing, which they do by registration, and their family may or may not wed. That's entirely up to the families themselves. So I call these 2 views the in-laws view and the bylaws view of marriage. and I signify during that hot debate and 2 referenda that you see there's a common value in both sides. Both sides want the institution of marriage to mean something, right? Both sides want maybe the divorce rate to decline instead of keep going up and up. Both sides want something meaningful of family that's going on in their lives. Otherwise, they would not debate marriage in the first place. And so ultimately our so-called Hyperlink Act to legalize marriage equality is to rule that homosexual people, when they wed as individuals, hyperlinking to all the rights and duties, the parts in the civil code. But it hyperlinks to none of the codes in the in-law relationships. So their families do not become in-laws to one another on the legal code and so on. And so this is not a compromise. This is an innovation that, just like Taiwan is caught between the Eurasian plate on one side and the Philippine Sea plate on the other, after earthquakes grows, right? Literally the tip of Taiwan grows 2 or 3 centimeters every year because of this tension, this earthquake. And the idea that I'm going to innovate no matter what the left wing says or the right wing says, I'm determinedly going upwing. I think this is something that any individual can say to become a force of common value out of the divisiveness and tension.
It's wonderful. The nature of really the reality of innovation, or the presence of innovation, given what I'm able to view and read about and research as I study Taiwan, seems so the innovation seems exponential, at least from my kind of far away sort of perspective, where, as I understand it, there's a phone number set up. There's one phone number that people can call in
That's
to
right.
ask questions, to raise grievances, all these. It seems like in those terms, there are some sort of basic, simple technologies set up that people can interface with all day, every day. And then there's the more sort of DIY aspects of more
Civic tech, yes.
civic tech. Exactly. I keep coming up against this, like, how do we even begin to innovate here? There seems to be so much here that is beyond an expiration date or beyond a certain level of decay. And there's also something beautiful in that decay itself, maybe from a Taoist perspective. But, given where we are now and that we are several weeks away from, an impending election that I truly hope will be happening, how do we, if you have any thoughts on how we can begin to innovate, given the size of the mountain we need to climb?
Yeah, I think there's a saying, although it's, I think, a Zen saying and not strictly a Taoist saying, but in Taiwan, as you know, they are very much intertwined. So the Zen saying says to whenever there's anything like a chaos or whatever emerging, and the Shengyan Zen master would say, you face it, accept it, deal with it, and let go of it. Or in Mandarin, 面对它，接受它，处理它，放下它. I think it's very relevant when, especially around the time of the election, that one really needs to face whatever really is that is going to happen in each and every election, that people are going to sow discord, are going to paint the other side as inhuman, and it's like a frenzy, and we go through that too in our presidential election, and so facing that and accepting that is very important, but also deal with that, because I have a bunch of friends who, very interestingly, in the height of the rally for the KMT president Han Kuo-yu and DPP president candidate Tsai Ing-wen, on the height of their rallies, where they are saying, not very calm seeming words, and they did a poll, a survey of the most important values for those two rallies and the most hardcore of their fans, and published the result. And surprisingly, to sustain and innovate the democratic institution themselves, to link with the world, and help in a humanitarian way, help on global issues. These two are high on both of the two most ardent, fervor supporters, except, of course, each side, I think the other side of candidate isn't doing anything about those two things. However, the values are so apparent that they're common, right? So it's interesting how you can get even, I think that survey was done literally like 2 weeks before the election day, like in the height of the campaigns. But it's also a way to deal with it, right? To show that no matter which side wins, quote unquote, they're going to work on the same two values that people value the most. And I think that's a really neat intervention that can let some of the partisanship go once the result is known.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear what you describe as both parties can get, so are actually the value system was so close to each other, and yet it gets so granular that in this sort of level of refraction of light, in which the granular levels are a little bit different. That's fascinating. It seems here our value systems, at least as portrayed in our media, seem continents or universes apart, and yet, yeah, as you say, to accept it as it is and to deal with it. I wonder, given if you can speak to a little bit of a timeline from the revolution moving forward, and how those sort of blocks of time have kind of maybe led into a sort of a smoother state of innovation, given the challenges we're facing every day.
Sure. Which revolution again? The Industrial Revolution? Sunflower. Okay. Right. Sunflower was in 2014, March. And for 3 weeks, the occupiers demonstrated as a demo, not as a protest, or a little bit of protest, but mostly as a demo of how to listen and scale and come to rough consensus on the street. And for example, the rough consensus on the street at the time was that at the time we're bidding, the major telecoms bidding for the spectrums to do the 4G infrastructure for wireless connections. The occupiers use WiMAX, by the way, which went nowhere. And so we had to do the 4G infrastructure over again. And so people were wondering whether, as part of the cross-strait surface trade agreement, at the time being deliberated on the street, because the MPs refused to deliberate it, we would allow Beijing-based components in the 4G infrastructure. And interestingly, the rough consensus, or the common value, was one of an economic argument. And the argument goes that because it's heavily state subsidized, it may appear inexpensive at the beginning, but because we all know that the Dang, the ruling party of the Chinese Communist Party, that's to say, can, through its party branches, to replace leadership for all the so-called private sector corporations that provides those 4G infrastructure equipments. At each and every upgrade, we have to do another system risk assessment to see whether this is now de facto state-owned or whether there are still some autonomy left in that company. And it's amortized. It's actually a much higher business cost than just working with Nokia or Ericsson and so on, and which doesn't have that problem of being taken over by their state at any given moment in time. And so, and people broadly come to consensus, and the magic thing is that the head of parliament eventually agreed with the occupiers and basically said, okay, let's just put the CSSTA on hold and start a nationwide conversation around economic and trade, and as the occupiers demanded. And out of it comes the e-participation platform and so on. So I think the lessons learned then is that any mayoral candidates that support these consensus on the street gets elected at the end of that year, sometime without an inauguration speech prepared. It's surprising even to them. And the mayor candidates, no matter which party, that did not support open governance, didn't get elected. So it's a very clear signal around the end of that year that the national direction from this point onward is going to be more transparency and more participation. There's no going back. And so then that's how the twin common values of making democracy work more in the here and now, and also connect to the world and share the Taiwan model to be as important to the KMT supporters as well as to the DPP supporters. I'm nonpartisan, by the way. And so in this point in time in 2019, I think the most important thing is just around the turn of the 2014 election at the end of that year. And by the presidential election of 2016, it became also quite apparent that after 2 years of experimenting with participatory budgeting, of citizens initiatives, voting, and whatever, in the mayors who has these as the campaign promise, including the Tainan's mayor Lai Qing William Lai, now our vice president, previously our premier, and also Dr. Ke Wen-je, mayor of Taipei City, still mayor of Taipei City. I think and also the party head of the new party, the Minzhongdang, the Taiwan People's Party. And so the point here is that if people form a consensus as strong as this, then of course the parliamentarians will say, okay, we're going to disclose the campaign donation and expenditure. We're going to live stream all the debate sessions in our committees and the party-to-party negotiations and things like that. And so it forms a social norm and gives the social sector a higher legitimacy than the government, but the government can have a very clear roadmap of the kind of low-hanging fruit to do in order to win back the legitimacy that was sorely lacking during the Sunflower Movement, which was at its lowest below 10%. And so, as you said, there is something beautiful in that decay of public trust, because then it paves the way of new systems, new organizations, and the new organization did not have to prove a lot. It only have to prove that it's worth more than 10% of people's trust.
Mm. Right. I don't know where to go from here at this moment. I think there's something to be said, maybe just to speak kind of, to kind of be in a self-reflective moment just for a second. I think it's interesting to having heard, many conversations, podcast interviews that you've been on, to allow for, in this instance, to allow for a little bit of space and contemplation, and then to maybe lead into whatever the next topic or next question may be. So what kinds of, so you, at the beginning of our conversation, that's a good one. At the beginning of this conversation, you were mentioning a recent disinformation campaign that you were working on, or you were helping to respond to. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. The disinformation campaign during our pandemic, we're post-pandemic now, but during the pandemic, the most recent, I mean, our baseball games are tens of thousands of people, concerts too, so, and they all wear masks, of course, but we are post-pandemic for quite a while now, but during the pandemic, people do feel anxious, and the humor over rumor playbook, I think, is still worth sharing. I remember a instance where there was a panic buying of instant noodles. There was a conspiracy theory that says the instant noodles are going to run out soon, and we all need to stockpile it and so on. And then the premier, using the humor over rumor playbook, immediately rolled out this huge cute scene banner, and basically him showing a display of a huge storage of food, and says that there's plenty of them and buy as much as you want. Just go out and buy. So basically it's kind of paradoxical prescription, right? People buy because they fear that there will be a shortage, and the premier is saying that buy as much instant noodle as you want. We have plenty more. We have years of reserve, in fact. And then but then he added to it, the next picture is that remember to also get vegetables, because a balanced diet is important for the fiber. And then all the agricultural counties and cities mayors came to basically post their own pictures and their favorite agricultural product from their production facilities, and it could be a local seafood, it could be a local fruit and things like that. And before long, it become a kind of festival, agricultural display, and it's just so much fun, and people share it because of the joy of participating in a kind of virtual festival of celebration of our agricultural goods, and people don't feel obsessed with the scarcity and the outrage of the original message anymore, because it's really a one-way street. If you start from anger and outrage, and then you get into a festive mood that already through creative means used up the tension in one's head, and one now feels celebratory that we're so plenty, right, when it comes to agricultural. And so, but if you see those very funny memes with instant noodles mixed with the premier and various mayors' heads and their favorite dish, then you literally are vaccinated against conspiracy theories. You cannot feel outrage when the conspiracy theory come. And so the humor has a higher R value than the rumor. And the point here is that it has to be on the same day, because if a person goes into sleep with outrage, then that kind of form a long-term association. So the next time that person sees that word, outrage is evoked, and no amount of cute dogs or interesting looking dishes is going to change that, right? It actually takes a really good food and maybe some, cha dao sessions to build new associations once it's fixed in long-term memory. But if the humor is rolled out literally like 1 hour or two after the disinformation campaign, and it's still firmly within the same day, and if within the same day before the midnight, it reaches more people and reaches people quicker because it's more fun, then the whole country goes to sleep in a much more joyful manner and wake up forming long-term association of the word instant noodle with this funny looking picture of people, mixing vegetables and whatever taro dishes or whatever with it, or a hot pot. There's many pictures in my mind right now. Whatever conspiracy theories will not form long-term association. In fact, I cannot recall any at the moment. Yeah.
So given the topic of conspiracy theories, I have been, up until this recently, I've been fairly uninformed regarding some of the bigger, longer term ones that we seem to be living with here, especially the seemingly expansive universe of QAnon. I wonder if you have any familiarity with or what you can see, having the distance across the Pacific Ocean, with this kind of level of conspiracy thinking that had its root at some point in the last several years and has grown into such a cross-border situation.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things, right? One is this, as I mentioned, this lockdown slash takedown that fosters mutual distrust. I think that's really the root, and whatever conspiracy theory and misinformation we see is really just a symptom. And disinformation, that's to say intentional misinformation, is just opportunists making the full opportunity of the crack in trust that's already there in the society. And so to solve that, I think is just to make social media pro-social again, and the social media is now taken to mean something very antisocial in parts of the world, and in Taiwan, I think we're really seeing this as its height around the 18th election/referenda, where the social media is at its peak anti-socialism, and we see, and with the light of, as I mentioned, the campaign donation and expenditure being published as raw data for analysis, we can see that the social media platforms actually channel a lot of foreign money into micro-targeted messages during the mayoral/referendum election. And none of that need to be disclosed because it was not classified as campaign donation, which is something really ridiculous now that we have the hindsight of 2020, literally. But at the time they were saying, we're a mere conduit and things like that. But anyway, the point here is that there's a strong social norm after the public sector agree with the social sector norm of radical transparency when it comes to campaign finance. And the investigative journalists highlighted the lack of transparency. And also in Taiwan, campaign donation can only be donated by citizens and certainly not by foreign citizens or foreign governments for that matter. And so there's a strong backlash against Facebook in particular, but also other global social media platforms. And I basically did a kind of trade negotiation with them. And it's very interesting because as a semi-ambassador to those semi-sovereign, they were at the time considering printing their own money, so semi-sovereign is just right. Semi-sovereign entities, or at least governance, when I understand that I only represent the societal norm and not represent my own interest. This puts me in a very strong negotiation position because my best alternative to a failure of negotiation is just social sanction. And in Taiwan, social sanction works much more powerfully than any legal action that could be done by the government. And so Facebook is basically faced with the choice of either conforming to the emerging social norm that any advertisement during elections/referenda need to be published as raw, open data for independent people to analyze in real time, or they can decline from publishing these advertisements altogether during the election/referendum seasons. They eventually chose the former and published the arts library. At the time in 2020 and end of 2019, I think the most transparent and real time they've done anywhere in any other jurisdiction. They were not deploying this kind of tailor-made code, but they understand the alternative would be strong social sanction. And so that's one way to repair the anti-social social media scene to be more pro-social is with a social mandate.
That's amazing. I hadn't heard of that until you just mentioned it. So I wonder, I'll have to look at any articles or news regarding that so I could point people to that. There's one more question I'd like to ask you while we have just a few more minutes. And it's a bit of a smaller conspiracy theory inquiry. And it has to do with people's trust with technology as it pertains to contact tracing and digital fence. And it seems as though I had been naively hoping that there would be some contact tracing consensus here, if not in the US, at least maybe in California or on the West Coast or something. And it seems as though people's immediate jump into, our state and federal governments cannot be trusted with our data. There's going to be a central database. There's this kind of like high tide, low tide, wave crashing of clashing bits of information. And so there's a very, very lukewarm, barely any sort of contact tracing, as I understand it, happening here. What is it that Taiwan was able to set up, and in what kind of time frame in terms of contact tracing, and how people took to that?
Well, the time frame is around a month's work when the CECC first set up, I think around mid-January. Actually, the day before, we even have a local confirmed case and started their daily live streaming. The idea of contact tracers, who are always humans in Taiwan, by the way, and not computers. Although computers used to be human too, but anyway, computer like editor used to refer to humans. Right. So contact tracers in Taiwan are always medical officers and the staff that work with medical officers. As a rule, we do not collect new data in the name of the pandemic. And I think that's the consensus, and both within the CECC and also on the street. And the reason is one of frugal innovation, because the property of each new line of code is not to be trusted even by the cybersecurity auditors. It takes precious time to audit its cybersecurity and privacy implications. On the other hand, there are already existing mechanisms for data collection. They are just not very granular. For example, all the 5 major telecoms already know your phone's whereabouts, but it's not for tracking you, right? So it's very rough. Like even in the most densely packed urban areas, it's just 50 meters or so in radius. So it doesn't know which block you're in. Basically, it knows which like part of district you're in, because they need this information to do roaming service, to transfer from one telecom tower to another telecom tower when you're moving fast by car to continue your call, right? So they already collect that data. And we already send out short text messages seconds before a earthquake or minutes before a flood. And so people are already getting this norm of they being in a wide area, not because we know precisely through GPS tracking or anything, but just out of caution, right? Sent a broadcast message to people roughly based on the telecom tower strength they're associated with, a kind of one-way signal that tells them that there is danger in this area. And so the digital fence which you described is built out entirely with these 2 existing mechanisms. There's 0 new data being collected. When you go back to Taiwan at the border, you can choose to go to a physical quarantine hotel, or you can stay at home if you have your own bathroom. And for 14 days, if you don't have a phone, we lend you a phone for 14 days. Otherwise, you can register your phone number, and that's all we need. And if the phone moves out of that 50-meter or so radius, a SMS is sent to the local medical and police institutions to check your whereabouts. But if you stay within that digital fence for 14 days, we pay you $100 a day as a stipend. But if you break out of the fence, and of course, you can always leave your phone there, but if it doesn't move for too long a while, we send an SMS too, checking your temperature and so on, and you're required to respond to that SMS. Anyway, so if you break out of the quarantine, the fine is 1,000 times that daily stipend. So you can fund 1,000 times more people in quarantine. And so very few people break out of quarantine. We all understand at the end of the 14 days, there's no constitutional basis to continue to deploy this SMS notification. And people understand because it's not an app. There's no way that this could, for example, interact with your WhatsApp or Instagram usage. And so that's 91% of people's approval rate. And the other 9%, we thank them for it because we've never declared state of emergency. So we have to answer to the parliamentary interpellation. And so when the Department of Cybersecurity's head, Howard Zinn, explained exactly how the digital fence works, how it partners with the 5 telecoms, how we do not collect new data, how the log rotation is still in effect. So after 14 days, we know nothing about your cell phone signal strength and so on. The approval rate grew to 94%. And of course, we still thank the other 6% because they keep us honest and accountable.
Mm. Yeah, I really appreciate the explanation of there's really no innovation going on in that regard of I'll use the word lightly, just enforcing a digital fence.
Mm-hmm.
It just really, I guess it really speaks to people's sheer lack of trust, maybe not even just with each other, but just with local municipality or state government, or maybe even our medical system, which, I mean, as we now know by today, or as of this week, we passed the really grim milestone of 200,000 deaths related to COVID here.
Mm-hmm.
Just take a breath for that, for the moment. And I think just one final thought I'd love to hear from you, so that just for posterity, so that people can hear this, in the future, is if you could speak to the, I've heard you say it's really not about the singularity, it's about plurality. If you could speak to that.
Sure. That's literally my job description. Back in 2016, when I first become digital minister, people keep confusing digital with IT, right? I keep saying that IT is machine talking to machines, and digital is how people talk to people. But still, there's a strong IT culture in Taiwan, so that it makes sense to kind of delineate how digital, of course, is dependent on the ICT infrastructure, but it's something else entirely. So I wrote my own job description in the form of a prayer when I was visiting New Zealand, and the news of me becoming the digital minister breaks out. And so that this is my job description. It goes like this. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that the singularity is near, let us always remember the plurality is here.
It's beautiful. Well, Audrey, I want to be respectful of the time allowance, and I really, really appreciate wholeheartedly the time you spent with me this morning. And there's really nothing but gratitude for this moment, this conversation. So I really appreciate the opportunity to continue to absorb what it is that you have done, what it is that you are doing over there, and to see what's going on in Taiwan as a beacon of hope, just in a humanitarian sense. And so, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Live long and prosper.
Bye.
Bye.